So it's become very common in scientific modern thought to believe that life is actually meaningless and that all of these vain attempts for us to find meaning in this life are fleeting aspirations. And this would be sort of the conclusion that the existentialists came to. Nihilism, essentially. Yet I sense there's sort of a problem in this, and even going farther into absurdism, I don't really see that as a practical solution either to this idea of meaning. And the angle that I want to approach this from is not from a philosophical or theological point of view, rather a biological, anthropological point of view. Perhaps psychological as well. It's not that we need to look inwards into ourselves to understand our own needs for meaning. Rather, we should look at what we are objectively as biological creatures with conscious psychological functioning and higher reasoning. We should look at who we are as human beings and communities and societies objectively and use those sort of tools to logically deduce what the meaning of life should be, rather than, first of all, believing in some god or tradition that's been passed down generationally, which is just an evolutionary product of emergence. We can go there in a different video. Or some kind of artificially conceived notion like will to power of Nietzsche. It's not quite artificially conceived, but an example of such artificial conception would be like sports or something we create to satisfy our need for meaning as a way to replace sort of the sense of meaning that we once received from war, for example. So first of all, let's start very simple, grassroots foundation. We are animals with genes who want to survive and reproduce. So before anything else, that is an essential component of the meaning of life. That is for life to continue itself and evolve and adapt, and by whatever means, continue being alive and pass on genes. That's what our drive is, by definition, essentially, because anybody who does not have that drive will either, just die or fail to reproduce. Because essentially, by definition, those who want to win will win, and winning is defined accordingly in this case. Now, what it looks like is this sort of crisis of meaning begins to occur once we have these very stable societies where survival is essentially guaranteed, reproduction is essentially guaranteed, and we have these high-class people who fall into depression because their lives are no longer meaningful, because the two things that are obvious, that is survival and reproduction, are no longer part of the question, essentially. There's endless pleasures that we can consume, but the drive that encourages us to continue living and have a sense of purpose and meaning is no longer there. We ourselves are supposed to be the tools by which we ensure the continuation of our own bloodline or species. But when that's essentially satisfied, when we have accumulated a vast fortune and have a big castle and we have a stable position in society, that drive becomes obsolete. However, when we look deeper into this thing that is survival and reproduction, there's also a third thing that we should be considering, and that is security for our future offspring. And what does that look like, really? Well, giving them an inheritance, perhaps, but also instilling in them a strong value system, one that can be passed down through the generations, stories, manners, etiquette. All of these things that we need to give to our children to ensure that they are successful in maintaining this stable position that we've achieved. So that's sort of the next stage beyond survival and reproduction. And this is sort of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing that we're looking at here. Although Maslow tends to focus more on the individual and sort of psychological analysis as to our hierarchical system of needs, but looking at ourselves as creatures of a larger society and looking at our offspring in particular, we want to ensure their security. And the security is all of those things that I listed before, not just money or inheritance. So it follows that what other things should we be concerning ourselves with if we want to guarantee the survival and reproduction of future offspring, but also their guaranteed success? Well, one very natural conclusion we might arrive at is that we want our offspring to have a stable community in which they're enveloped with people who can be trusted and relied upon because, as we know, teams of people can get things done exponentially more efficient than an individual could. It's a different order of magnitude. And in particular, we really want to have a solid community of people who have a level of trust that is unconditional. That would be a good thing. That would be very a strong way to ensure the continued survival of our offspring. As a small example, imagine a group of soldiers, a team, a unit bound together in a room, in combat, whatever. They're waiting to fire on the enemy, and suddenly a grenade flies into the room, a live grenade. They all see it, but there's no time for them to leave the room. But one guy gets up and he jumps on the grenade, and that one guy dies, but he saves his entire team. And if that one guy had not done that, they all might have died. But it's the fact that all of them were willing to do that this one guy was able to do it. And this is just one example of how we can see how a team working together accomplishes more, orders of magnitude more than just an individual. And you want to have that level of unconditional trust. And you yourself also need to be willing to give yourself to that in order to ensure the trust of your teammate. So do you see how the game becomes more complicated when we start thinking about societies and groups rather than just individuals? If I want to be part of that group of soldiers, who survive, by the way, mostly except for the one guy, if I want to be part of that group, I need to be willing to throw myself on the grenade, which means you need to be willing to give your life for some greater cause. And so this is where the meaning of life takes us, because if we want to be a part of one of these solid communities where surviving and thriving are more likely, even if there might be some situation where you need to sacrifice yourself, you are still part of a strong community where your survival and thriving is more likely, even though, like I said, that's the case where you need to throw your life away for the greater good. So the question of this greater good is, what is that greater good supposed to be? Well, at its most basic level, it's your family, obviously. Any man should be willing to give his life for his wife and children. Any mother would probably give her life for her children. And this takes us to the Tolstoyan perspective, which he outlines very nicely in his work, The Kingdom of God is Within You, which is a religious text, but it contains a lot of philosophical wisdom in it. Even if you don't want to accept his truths on Christianity, you can at least acknowledge that people have a sense of belonging or sense of greater good for units of increasing size. This is not even really a claim that Tolstoy puts forward. There's different ways of looking at your life as a unit. I have some friends in the UK, and when I talk to them, we like to, contrast America with the UK and Europe as a whole. And one of the things that they always have made clear to me is that they see themselves more as a piece of the UK rather than their own individual person, which is a sort of nuanced question, and there's definitely lots of details to get to in there. But I've always seen myself as more of an individual who happens to be American. And maybe that's a distinction between American and Europeans, but it's also just an example of how there's different ways that we can look at ourselves as pieces of larger wholes, or as individuals, or as members of families. And, nationality is, of course, one of the biggest examples. And where Tolstoy goes is this sort of principle of world harmony, is going beyond nationality even, and seeing yourself as just a member of the world. And he says that that is, in principle, the core idea of Christianity. But so what is this community then of people who are willing to die for each other and willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good? What do we want to call that? Well, we can give it a name. We can call it home. And it follows that the bigger and more powerful our home is, the more likely we are to ensure our own survival, but also, more importantly, the survival and continuation of our bloodline, or our genes, or our last name, however you want to conceptualize it, the continuation of whatever we are. So in that sense, our analysis has led us to the conclusion that the meaning of life is to strengthen your home, strengthen and expand your home, defined in that very precise way, but I think it's a good definition. You want to strengthen and expand your home as much as you can. Let me know what you think. This is unscripted. This is just some ideas that I'm tossing around. So let me know what you think in the comments, if this idea has any merit. And if you're into this sort of content, make sure to subscribe and stick around. Thanks. That's all.